"I am my mother's lawyer," declared 9-year-old David Thompson in the courtroom, his voice startling Judge Harrison and his biological father, Robert Wellington. Despite his young age, David's words cut through the formal quiet of the family court during a multi-million-dollar custody case. He stood beside his mother, Janet, who watched him with a mixture of pride and fear. Judge Harrison initially dismissed David, stating it was a legal hearing for adults. However, David calmly asserted his right to express his opinion on matters directly affecting him, citing Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which the United States had ratified. Robert Wellington, a wealthy Chicago real estate magnate, seemed agitated, as his expensive lawyers were unprepared for such a challenge. Janet Thompson, David's mother, worked long hours as a nursing assistant to raise David independently, while Robert had only appeared in David's life 4 times in 8 years, always with gifts and unfulfilled promises, but now suddenly sought full custody. Dr. Mitchell, Robert's lead attorney, interjected, calling the situation irregular and questioning David's legal capacity. David interrupted him, stating he had a right to be heard and that if they truly cared for his well-being, they would listen rather than attempt to silence him. Robert whispered urgently to Dr. Mitchell, but David continued, opening his meticulously scribbled school notebook. David informed the judge that he had prepared a documented presentation explaining why he should remain with his mother, including evidence of the petitioner's true motives, which he believed the court would find very illuminating. Robert's face visibly paled, wondering what his son had uncovered and how a 9-year-old had prepared better than his own high-priced legal team. Everyone in the courtroom recognized they were witnessing an extraordinary event, a boy holding secrets that could dismantle falsehoods. Dr. Mitchell quickly regained his composure, reiterating that the court handled complex family law issues requiring adequate legal representation. David promptly retorted, asking why he wasn't provided with legal representation then, noting that throughout the 8 months of the case, no one considered it important to hear the opinion of the person most affected by the decision. Robert Wellington shifted uncomfortably, bothered by David's calmness, who appeared unfazed by the formal setting, the expensive lawyers, or his biological father's imposing presence. Janet observed her son with a mix of pride and apprehension, recalling how David had been bringing home legal codes, children's rights manuals, and court precedents from the library for weeks, which she had mistakenly dismissed as mere academic curiosity. Dr. Mitchell reiterated that his client, Robert, genuinely sought custody for his son's welfare, claiming Ms. Thompson lacked the resources to provide the educational and social opportunities a gifted child like David deserved. "Interesting," David mumbled, reopening his notebook. He paused on the phrase, "genuine concern," and then asked the judge for permission to share some facts about this so-called concern. Judge Harrison, accustomed to countless custody cases, had never encountered a situation like this, facing a child with articulation and preparation surpassing many adults. Janet softly suggested they let the lawyers handle it, but David gently interrupted her, pointing out their inability to afford lawyers like Dr. Mitchell, meaning he had to speak for them or no one would. Robert Wellington finally spoke, calling David son, and admitting the situation was confusing. David coldly cut him off, stating, "Don't call me son." He then revealed that in his 9 years, Robert had appeared exactly 4 times, 2 late birthday visits, 1 Christmas visit squeezed between social engagements, and 1 for a photo opportunity with the local press for a story on philanthropic entrepreneurs. The resulting silence was profound. Robert opened his mouth to protest, but David continued, recounting their last meeting 6 months prior, when Robert spent only 15 minutes in their apartment, criticizing their furniture, complaining about his mother's hospital smell, and suggesting David had potential with a proper education. David adjusted his glasses, then pointed out that Robert filed for custody 2 weeks after that visit. Dr. Mitchell whispered something urgent to Robert, but David wasn't finished. David informed the court that his research on his biological father revealed a recent, costly lawsuit loss against his business partners, his third wife's contested divorce filing, and a very interesting discovery about a trust fund established by his late paternal grandmother. Robert Wellington's face paled further, astonished that his 9-year-old son had uncovered information his own lawyers were unaware of. David turned a page in his notebook, smiling for the first time since entering the courtroom, not an innocent child's smile, but one of someone holding winning cards. "Before we discuss inheritances and financial motives," David stated, closing his notebook, "how about we discuss why a man who never showed any genuine interest in being a father suddenly developed such a strong paternal instinct?" Robert Wellington was visibly perspiring, and his expensive lawyers appeared utterly lost, having not prepared to face a child who seemingly knew more about their client's financial situation than they did. The judge leaned forward, his judicial curiosity piqued, noting David's exceptional articulation. He asked David what kind of evidence a 9-year-old could have gathered. David, adjusting his glasses in a gesture becoming his courtroom trademark, explained that for the past 3 months since learning of the lawsuit, he had dedicated every Tuesday and Wednesday afternoon to researching at the Central Public Library. Dr. Mitchell condescendingly interrupted, asking what he researched. David listed public records, newspaper archives, available corporate documents, and Mr. Wellington's previous court cases, opening a new section of his notebook. He added that the head librarian, Ms. Rodriguez, who held a master's degree in information science, had taught him how to access basic legal databases. Janet watched her son in astonishment, realizing David's special project at the library was actually to save their family. Robert Wellington finally erupted, calling it ridiculous for a 9-year-old to dig into his private life like a private investigator. David calmly corrected him, stating it was public information, perfectly legal and accessible to any American citizen, regardless of age. Ms. Rodriguez had become much more than a librarian to David. When David first approached her asking about family courts, Ms. Rodriguez quickly recognized his determination disguised as desperation. She had told Janet the week before that David had been coming to the library religiously for 3 months, reading legal codes like other children read comic books, learning at an unusually rapid pace. David methodically continued his presentation, revealing that in the past 18 months, Mr. Wellington had faced 3 significant lawsuits. He lost a $2.3 million dispute with former partners in Wellington Industries, and his third wife had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, which in legal code meant he hid money from her. Robert's face was red with anger. "And more interestingly," David interrupted, methodically turning pages, "I discovered that my late paternal grandmother, Eleanor Wellington, established a trust fund of $1.7 million specifically for me, accessible only when I turn 18 or when my biological father obtains full legal custody." The courtroom fell silent. Dr. Mitchell whispered urgently to Robert, who completely ignored him. David continued, stating it was no coincidence. He explained that his grandmother died when he was 2, and for 7 years, Mr. Wellington never mentioned his existence to her, never let them meet, never allowed her to know she had a grandson. Janet remembered perfectly that Robert had been adamant that his family didn't need to know about it, referring to his own son. However, when Mrs. Eleanor Wellington discovered David through private investigation, which David found in the estate records, she immediately set up the fund with a very specific condition. David paused dramatically, ensuring everyone was listening. The money would be released for his care and education only if his father demonstrated genuine commitment to the child's welfare by obtaining legal custody. If he never sought custody, the money would go directly to David at age 18 with no parental access whatsoever. David concluded that the math was simple and cruel. David explained that Robert had ignored him for 9 years, missing his chance to access the inheritance through natural custody, and now, broke and desperate, he was trying to force late custody to gain access to the funds. "But there's something my grandmother couldn't have foreseen," David added, closing his notebook. She didn't know her son would develop a career in ruining small family businesses through predatory practices. Dr. Mitchell abruptly stood, declaring that David was making baseless accusations. "I can prove everything I'm saying," David countered, opening his school backpack and pulling out a surprisingly organized manila folder. He presented copies of 17 lawsuits from the past 5 years, showing Wellington Industries purchased properties from financially distressed families well below market value using insider information obtained through bank contacts. Janet watched, astonished, as her son transformed a custody hearing into an impromptu criminal investigation using only a public library and relentless determination. David continued, pulling printed photos from the folder, describing how one of these families, the Santos family, Mexican immigrants who owned a small bakery, worked 18 hours a day. Mr. Wellington found out through a friend at the bank that they were 3 months behind on their loan due to their youngest son's emergency hospitalization. Robert Wellington was now visibly sweating. Robert tried to object, but David interrupted, stating it showed a pattern of behavior, a man who preys on vulnerable families for financial gain, and now was trying to prey on his own vulnerable family for the same reason. Judge Harrison leafed through David's documents, his expression increasingly serious. He asked David where he obtained the information. David meticulously listed his sources, public court records, local newspaper archives, and incorporation documents available on the state database. He added that Ms. Rodriguez taught him that the truth is almost always publicly available, one just needs to know where to look. Dr. Mitchell attempted one last push. Dr. Mitchell argued that even if David's allegations were true, which they were not admitting, they did not change the fact that his client could provide better educational opportunities for the child. David smiled, a calculated smile, not an innocent one, as he had saved his strongest card for last. About education, he stated, opening a final section of his notebook, "May I share something interesting about Mr. Wellington's educational plans for me?" It was then that Robert Wellington fully comprehended his underestimation. His 9-year-old son was not only intelligent but strategic, having uncovered secrets even his own lawyers did not know. The silent courtroom awaited the final, devastating revelation. David repeated, on the subject of education, opening the final section of his notebook with the precision of a surgeon, "I would like to share Mr. Wellington's true educational plans for me." Robert Wellington swallowed hard, his eyes nervously darting between his lawyer and the boy who had become his worst nightmare. David methodically continued, stating that during one of his 4 visits over the past 9 years, he overheard a very interesting phone conversation where Mr. Wellington was talking about solving the child problem after obtaining custody. Dr. Mitchell abruptly stood, arguing private conversations could not be used. "I can prove every word," David interrupted, pulling a small digital recorder from his briefcase, explaining that Ms. Rodriguez taught him that documenting evidence is fundamental to any legal case. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert Wellington was visibly shaking, his fingers nervously drumming on the table as he realized he had completely underestimated his son's intelligence. "This recording was made during his last visit to our apartment 6 months ago," David calmly explained to the judge. David explained that Mr. Wellington thought he was doing homework in his room, but the recorder was left on in the living room. Judge Harrison examined the device and asked if David was sure he wanted to present it as evidence. David affirmed he was absolutely certain. The recording, featuring Robert Wellington's unmistakable voice, echoed through the silent courtroom. Robert was heard saying, "Listen, as soon as I get legal custody, the boy is going straight to Riverside Military Academy. It's a strict boarding school in Colorado. They know how to handle troubled children. He'll stay there until he's 18, and I'll have full access to the inheritance funds for educational expenses." The other person's voice was inaudible, but Robert continued, "Exactly. $500 a month for boarding. The rest is mine. The kid doesn't even have to know about the money. It's a perfect solution. She's out of the picture. I have access to the funds, and I still look like a responsible father." Janet covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face, realizing Robert's cruel plan. Dr. Mitchell was pale, seeing his client destroyed by his own words. "There's more," David calmly added, stopping the recording. The second part of the recording was even more devastating, Robert stating, "The problem isn't just the money. It's that the boy is too smart for his own good. He asks questions, observes everything. It would be best to keep him out of the picture until he's 18, and I can sort out the financial situation. Kids like him, well, you know, we don't want him getting any idea is above his station." Robert Wellington exploded, calling it a trap and claiming David provoked him, saying a 9-year-old couldn't. David interrupted him, his voice cutting like a knife, asking, "A 9-year-old can't what?" can't be smart, can't defend himself, can't expose the truth about a father who sees him as a problem to be solved. Judge Harrison turned off the recorder and told Robert Wellington that the recording, combined with the financial evidence, painted a very clear picture of his true motivations. David continued, stating he had also discovered that Riverside Military Academy had a terrible track record, with 3 student suicides in the last 5 years and a federal investigation for physical and emotional abuse of minors. Dr. Mitchell attempted one last desperate card, arguing that his client had superior financial resources. David interrupted him, asking, "To send me to a place where children die to use my inheritance money while pretending to care about me? To isolate me from the only person who truly loves me?" Robert Wellington completely lost his composure, calling David an arrogant child who didn't know his place and reminding him, "I'm your father. You're a stranger who shares my DNA," David calmly replied, sending a chill through the room. A real father wouldn't try to get rid of his own son to steal his money. The judge banged his gavel to restore order, instructing Mr. Wellington to sit down or be removed. David turned to the last page of his notebook, stating there was one final thing he needed to mention, something he discovered about why his grandmother really set up that trust fund. Robert Wellington paled further. David revealed he found a letter from his grandmother in the estate files, addressed to him to be opened when he turned 16, but the librarian helped him find out he could request early access in custody disputes. The final bombshell was about to drop. David explained his grandmother wrote that she knew Robert was never a good father, that she established the trust specifically to protect David from him, and that if Robert ever tried to get custody just for the money, David should use every resource in the trust to defend himself. David closed the notebook and looked directly at Robert Wellington, adding that she even hired private investigators who documented all of Robert's financial schemes over the years, and it was all on file with the fund's administrator. Robert Wellington slumped in his chair, finally realizing he had been completely outmaneuvered by a 9-year-old he had considered nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle. Judge Harrison banged his gavel, categorically denying the custody request based on all the evidence presented, including financial documents, recordings, and the plaintiff's demonstrated history. Furthermore, he ordered a full investigation into the possible fraudulent use of trust funds. Dr. Mitchell whispered urgently to Robert, but it was clear the case was irrevocably lost. David methodically put away his materials, maintaining his calm demeanor throughout the hearing. He asked to make one last request, which the judge granted. David stated he did not do this out of anger or revenge, but because every child deserves a family that truly loves them, not one that sees them as a financial opportunity. As Robert Wellington was escorted out of the room by security guards, ordered arrested by the judge for attempted fraud, David finally allowed a small smile to appear on his face. In that silent courtroom, a 9-year-old child had demonstrated that intelligence, preparation, and true love could overcome any amount of money and privilege. David's victory represented more than a simple custody battle. It was the start of a transformation that would forever change his family's life. 3 years later, David Thompson's life had transformed in unforeseen ways. The recording that led to Robert Wellington's downfall not only won the case but went viral on social media, making David a national symbol for children who refuse to silently endure injustice. The video amassed over 50 million views and inspired legislative changes in 17 U.S. states. 12-year-old David Thompson, now taller and wearing new glasses but still calm, appeared on America's most watched morning show. When asked how it felt to be called the smartest kid in America, David smiled and replied he'd prefer to be called David, who learned that every child has a voice, even when adults pretend not to listen. The studio audience erupted in emotional applause. Janet watched from backstage, wearing her nursing supervisor's uniform, a promotion she received after her story inspired a national campaign for working mothers. Her hospital established a scholarship fund called the Janet Thompson Program for children of low-income employees. The host invited Janet on stage, who, despite her shyness, radiated the same pride she felt that day in court. Janet stated that David had always been special, but what made her most proud was his heart, not just his intelligence, as he chose to use his story to help other families instead of bragging. Indeed, David had spent the last 3 years visiting schools in underserved communities, educating children about their basic legal rights. His book, Every Child Has a Voice, became a bestseller, with all proceeds funding a program that provided free legal assistance to families in custody disputes. The host asked David about his Cool Law Library project. David, adjusting his trademark glasses, explained that after seeing how a public library saved him, he realized many other children faced similar situations without knowing where to find help. They created small sections in 1,200 public libraries, containing children's rights books in simple language and computers with free access to basic legal resources. The camera focused on Janet, who discreetly wiped away a tear, having witnessed her son transform personal trauma into a social movement over 3 years. Meanwhile, across town, Robert Wellington watched the program from his small studio apartment in the Chicago suburbs. His hair was gray, his clothes simple, and he worked as a salesman at an electronics store, the only job he could find after his story became public. The court-ordered investigation had uncovered not only his attempt to defraud David's trust fund but also a web of financial schemes that completely destroyed Wellington Industries. Robert lost everything. Robert lost his company, mansion, marriage, and reputation, and he spent 18 months in prison. "The kid's on the show again," he muttered angrily, turning off the television, as David's story had appeared somewhere almost every week for 3 years, reminding the world of his crimes. The most painful aspect for Robert was David's consistent maturity when asked about his biological father. David never spoke ill of him publicly, which further embarrassed Robert. "I hope he finds peace and learns that true love cannot be bought or stolen," David had said in a recent interview, adding that holding a grudge helps no one, but setting boundaries is essential to protecting loved ones. Back in the television studio, the host asked David what advice he would give to other children facing difficult family situations. David paused, then looked directly into the camera, advising them that they are not alone, they possess more power than they realize, and the truth always triumphs, even when it seems impossible. He paused again, then continued with the wisdom of someone who had faced giants and won, urging them not to let anyone convince them they are too small to make a difference. "I was 9 years old when I changed my life and my mother's life forever. You can change yours too," he concluded. 6 months later, David received a special letter from Sophia Martinez, a 10-year-old from Los Angeles, who used the Cool LA Libraries project to help her immigrant grandmother avoid an unfair eviction. Sophia's letter ended with thanks for teaching her that every child has a voice, which she used to save her family. Janet found David reading the letter in his room, surrounded by hundreds of similar letters from children nationwide. She asked him how it felt to know his courage had inspired so many. David carefully folded Sophia's letter and placed it in a special box where he kept all his correspondence. He then asked Janet if she remembered telling him that sometimes the scariest things in life turn out to be the most important. Janet nodded, remembering that conversation perfectly. David then said he understood now. If Robert Wellington had never tried to separate them, David would never have discovered that a child can change the world when adults stop underestimating them. That same day, David received another life-changing call. Harvard University offered him a full scholarship to a special program in law and social justice, the first of its kind, created specifically for students who had demonstrated exceptional social leadership before the age of 16. Janet asked if he would accept, and David replied he would, on one condition. He wanted to use his education to create a legal system that protects all children, not just those fortunate enough to be smart enough to protect themselves. Years later, at 16, David Thompson became the youngest lawyer ever admitted to the bar. His first case was a lawsuit against the educational system for failing to teach basic children's rights in public schools, which he won, setting a precedent that made legal education mandatory for all American students. Robert Wellington never fully recovered from his downfall, living modestly and working low-paying jobs. In moments of self-honesty, he sometimes thought about the extraordinary son he had lost to greed, recognizing that David had become exactly the kind of man he himself had never been able to be. David Thompson's story proved that true strength comes not from money or connections, but from a combination of intelligence, courage, and unconditional love. A 9-year-old boy defeated a corrupt system using only a public library, unwavering determination, and the transformative power of truth. David learned that when fighting for what is right, the universe conspires in one's favor. Robert Wellington learned that underestimating a determined child can be the most expensive mistake of a lifetime. And millions of children around the world learned that their voices matter, their rights are real, and they are never too small to fight for justice. David's greatest revenge was not destroying Robert Wellington. His greatest revenge was building a legacy that would save thousands of families from the same injustices he had faced. This story of courage and determination proves that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones the world insists on underestimating.